The history of my father's side of the family from 1940 to the present begins during World War II in 1941 when the Japanese had just begun their war in the Pacific. Starting on December 8, 1941, the Japanese army began to invade the Philippines, starting with the attacks on Clark Air Base and Nichols Field just outside the Philippines' capital city of Manila. Then on January 2, 1942, Japan had occupied all of Manila. My great-grandfather, Diosdado Torres, and his wife Placencia Torres were living in Manila at the time, and my great-grandmother was pregnant with the baby that would later become my grandmother. In 1942, Diosdado decided to join a Filipino medical corps to help fight the Japanese army. But later that year, my grandmother received a letter from the corps saying that my great-grandfather had been killed. After this, Placencia moved to the Filipino province of Bulacan, where she gave birth to my grandmother, Estrella Torres, in 1943. It was in Bulacan where my grandmother was raised throughout her childhood until meeting my grandfather, Augusto Salvador, during her college years. The two got married and eventually had 4 sons, including my father Arnel, their firstborn, followed by Augusto Jr., Albert, and Alex. Then, due to family problems, my grandmother took her 4 sons and emigrated to the United States on June 13, 1974. The 4 brothers and their mother lived in Detroit, Michigan during their early years in the U.S. While in Detroit, Estrella worked as an accountant and bookkeeper for Zbart International Corporation, an automotive aftermarket company that specialized in rust-proofing and detailing. A crucial event happened into the auto business in 1979. The automobile industry, specifically the Chrysler Company, was beginning to crash and was on the verge of bankruptcy. The company was in need of a $1.5 billion loan from the federal government. This was a result of several factors at the time, including high gas prices, high interest rates, dropping automobile sales, and heavy international competition. These factors caused many automobile companies to begin firing employees and cutting budgets. With fear of losing her job, Estrella moved to California in June 1981 with 3 of her sons, while my father stayed in Detroit on his own for a couple of months in order to finish his first quarter of college. After moving to California, Estrella was employed by the Borg-Warner Corporation, another automotive company, where she would work as a cost accountant for the next 20 years. Then, after my father had finished his first quarter of college, he followed his family to California on January 1st, 1982. Throughout the 1980s, the biggest influence on the United States was the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1981. The 1980s became known as the last decade of the Cold War because of the work of Ronald Reagan. During his 2 terms, President Reagan was credited for having the nation's longest recorded period of peacetime prosperity without recession or depression. Perhaps one of his greatest achievements was agreeing on a major reduction on weapons stocks at a meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland in October 1986. It was here where the nuclear threats of America and the Soviet Union began to die down when Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev made their agreement. After living in California for almost 2 years, my father met my mother Caroline Santos on December 17, 1983. The two then got married on October 10, 1992 in San Provaso Church in Venice, Italy. 3 years later, my older sister Alexa was born in January 1995, followed by my birth in December 1996, and then my little sister Allison's birth in January 2001. During the time period where my parents were starting out our family, the world was characterized by a technological revolution. Developments in computers, communication devices, and medicines and hygiene were what characterized the early 2000s. With these technological advancements, the world was said to have shrunk by the fact that traveling or simply communicating with a person on the other side of the world became as easy as pressing a glass screen. Our current generation now lives in the most technologically based era the world has ever seen, and now the future holds immeasurable potential in technological developments and other world affairs that my grandchildren and their grandchildren will live to experience.